Chris, we're talking about fintechs today, and specifically fintechs through their in-house lawyer perhaps, who are negotiating with a bank. First question, is it even worth the while of the fintech to try and negotiate this deal?
Yes, very much so, for a whole number of different reasons.
Okay, so you've got some reasons.
Yeah.
Let's get into them.
So there are certain things in one of these template documents that you usually end up having to negotiate on that you probably won't be able to move on. It's not worth your time, your effort to do it. Those will tend to be things where there's a broader policy, where there's some kind of regulatory risk around it, where the bank just won't move. And the legal team that you're negotiating with will have very little power to change it. That'll tend to be things like anti-bribery stuff, anything to do with fraud, anything to do with, or the vast majority of things to do with audit. They're just not going to move, so it's not really worth trying. But there's other things that are often presented as a fait accompli, that like, this is our standard template, this is how we operate, where when you get into it, you find out quite quickly there's a lot of overreach, a huge amount of flexibility and rights that the bank gives themselves that frankly aren't justified at all. That when you start scratching and sort of poking at it, you find actually you can negotiate quite a lot. And they're things that can really matter to how the deal progresses for the benefit of the fintech. So,
but if I put myself in the position of an in-house lawyer at a fintech and I'm negotiating that deal, so you're saying you've got a bunch of things in this contract that the bank is either never going to give on, or if they give, only at the cost of quite a lot of capital getting them there. But then there are other things which they say they're not going to give on, but actually they will. So it sort of begs the question, how do you know the difference between the two?
Partly with experience. There's no routine set formula for it, and each bank is slightly different. Typically the stuff that is closer to the nuts and bolts of the commercial deal that you'll have largely done by the time you get into a negotiating room with a contract, those are the things that tend to have a little bit more flexibility. So classic example, a term in a standard MSA that says we can terminate this at any time on 30 days notice. And you look at that and say, well, hang on a minute, that means this isn't the 3-year deal that we've been talking about for the past 6 months. It's actually a rolling 30-day deal. That can't be right. And eventually you find that actually that clause will be changed. Other things like ownership of IP, use and reuse of data, things to do with the payment terms or milestones, those will tend to be not necessarily easy to move, but they will be things typically that you can move once you've gone through the process of advocating for that change. But you've got to pick your battles carefully.
So Chris, if your first big point was knowing what the bank is going to give on and realistically what they're not, my question for you now is, how invested should that fintech be in that specific deal, or is it about being pragmatic and playing the long game?
Yeah, so if you're acting for a fintech and they get into one of these deals, it's a big operation, it's a big expense of time and therefore runway. So that you should only be going into it if you are committed to it, but that's very much at the forefront all the way through should be that pragmatism about what's worth fighting on and what isn't worth fighting on. There's no way that as a fintech doing a deal with a big institution, you're not going to end up taking risk on all sorts of clauses where you look at it and think, well, I wouldn't normally do that. You're not going to get away with getting the document to a perfect place. I think the trick is in knowing what the things are that are worth fighting on, because they have a direct impact on how your business is going to grow and succeed in that partnership, versus the things which look quite scary and technically are quite scary. They could be technically some very big risks, but are quite unlikely to happen in real life. They're things that are probably more technical risks than they are day-to-day operational risks. So there's no point in kind of winning every point on the audit clause if you haven't sorted out the thing that's going to stop you from getting paid for huge amounts of time, or is going to hold you into that relationship even if the relationship is failing and you want to be able to go out and talk to another bank, for instance, in an exclusivity context, that kind of thing. So yeah, very much all the way through, almost clause by clause, it should be a weighing up of the cost of making the change and arguing for that, and the time and the capital and every other part of dealing with that, versus what's the real pragmatic effect of making this change or living without the change.
Okay, and running with that, pragmatically, how do you think fintechs typically should set boundaries between their expectations, their needs, and those of their new partner?
Yeah, so some of the most successful fintech deals I've seen with banks on the other side have been the ones where, often because it's quite complicated, the fintech has set out really early on what it is they really want from the deal. So because it's such a big project, it's such a big expense really to go into one of these negotiations, they've really nailed down, we're going into this because we need this IP to do this with it afterwards. We need the bank to do these 3 things. And if those don't happen and that doesn't last for at least 3 years, there's just no point in us being here. They get that written down, communicate it to the bank early. Why? Because banks have a nasty habit of changing leadership, of changing approach, sometimes frankly of just changing their minds partway through one of these usually quite long negotiations. Now, if you haven't got any of that stuff agreed and set out between you beforehand, and it doesn't have to be anything as much as a heads of terms, it can be just an email, frankly. If you haven't got that done, then you're left arguing against a much bigger, more powerful player as to why that isn't fair. That doesn't really wash. If you've done it the other way around, so you've got something that's agreed between you, you've got something that carries a lot more moral weight, and it's a lot easier to say, look, the whole reason we've been sitting in this negotiating room for 2 months is because we were doing it on this basis. So if you're absolutely adamant that you want to change it, then we need something else. It's a very, very different flavour to the conversation, a much stronger stance to have.
So Chris, we talked about, number one, knowing what the bank is going to move on and what they won't. Number 2, playing the long game. Yep. And number 3, how the fintech sets its boundaries. So at the outset, I asked, can you even negotiate these deals? And you clearly said yes. Yep. So I've got a bonus question for you. Which side of the table do you prefer being on, fintech or financial institution?
So I've done a decent amount of both. Actually, I prefer the fintech side. That's kind of why I'm a fintech lawyer. That's why I do what I do. It's scrappier. You have to be a lot more inventive about it. It's a lot more fun, I think.
Well, no wonder you talk about it with such enthusiasm.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.